start. We'll have more people who will trickle in, and I hope we get a good showing on our live stream. A number of the people who go around with us are in the courthouse now to support Amr, who was arrested that day that many of us were arrested when Secretary of State Blinken was testifying. And uh, he was one of the few people of color who was arrested. Everybody else got off on a $50 fine and no consequences. And he was accused of assaulting a police officer, which he did nothing of the kind. He just stood up, said his words, even said, "I'm not resisting," and walked out. And yet he has been charged with that. They said they were going to drop that charge, which was good. But then he just found out yesterday that they put it back in again. So that's why folks went this morning to show solidarity. And, he was, now if they're going to put that charge in, he's going to insist on going to trial because there's absolutely no evidence that he was resisting anything. But I think it's a clear example of singling somebody out because they're a person of color and also trying to send a message to the rest of us. But we will not be deterred, right? We will fight on just like Cori Bush. And I think before we begin today with our teaching on AIPAC, we timed it today because we were worried that what happened would happen. And that is AIPAC coming in and throwing $9 million into her race, picking an opponent, and taking her out, just like they did in the case of Jamal Bowman. But we're going to go into that in more detail. Can everybody hear okay? The sound in this room is not the greatest, so we'll have to speak loudly.
Never been a problem.
Good. And we've got a lot of things to go through. But I wanted to give Robert the first crack at this because he is with an organization, the Council on American Islamic Affairs, Council on American Islamic Relations, that has done such amazing work for many, many years. Does not focus on this issue of AIPAC, but actually tangentially is always bumping up against what AIPAC is doing. So Robert, who is in charge of government affairs, is going to start out with his comments about AIPAC.
All right, well, thank you so much, Medea. On behalf of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, I'm going to face this way so I can address our internet audience. I want to express my sincere gratitude to Code Pink for hosting this crucial teach-in on AIPAC. Now, before I start, I just need to clarify, as a 501c3 nonprofit, CARE doesn't endorse or oppose any candidate running for office, and we don't have favorability. But with that said, CARE's mission is to protect the civil rights of American Muslims and to mobilize our community of over 8 million American Muslims to be civically engaged and to advocate for themselves, not just protecting their civil liberties, but using their constitutional rights to assemble, to speak freely, to petition the government, and to be civically engaged. And out of that, we have over 2 million Muslim voters that are active in this democratic process in this election year. And so we're hoping that they turn out in large numbers and vote for the candidates that best reflect their views. So my portion of today's speech is going to focus on AIPAC's recent anti-Black and anti-Muslim attacks on sitting members of Congress, a little bit about its size, its scope, its history, and its undue influence, and how we need to grow our own voices and our institutions. So as you may know, for the past several decades, organizations representing Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and allied communities, and countless community leaders and ally leaders like Medea, have been targeted by a multi-million-dollar U.S. Islamophobia network that is in support of also the government of Israel and their ongoing policies of occupation, apartheid, and now genocide. This network includes the Anti-Defamation League and, of course, the American Israel Public Affairs Council, known as AIPAC, along with a number of other numerous elected officials agency administrators, staff, law enforcement officers who all subscribe to these anti-Muslim or anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian views and promote these types of misinformation or conspiracies. Now, these groups aim to silence the advocacy efforts of our communities, particularly on the issues of Palestinian human rights, by painting us with a broad brush. These tactics involve in bad faith attacks and accusations. Muslim groups and leaders are falsely labeled by groups like AIPAC as proxies or supporters of foreign governments when they themselves are actually a proxy or supporter of Israel. And they also make false accusation of being connected to designated terrorist groups. Their goal is to make our communities politically radioactive, as in being unapproachable, to deny us an equal platform to express our views. So a little bit about AIPAC. AIPAC is a 501c4. It's a political advocacy organization. It raises more than $100 million a year, which is spent on lobbying politicians and sending members to Congress on trips to Israel. In March, it was announced that AIPAC, in conjunction with its affiliated super PAC, United Democracy Project, is expected to spend over $100 million across its political entities in the 2004 election season, opposing candidates that they reject as just not being supportive of Israel. Now, compared to the operating budgets of groups like CARE, Code Pink, American Muslims for Palestine, other Palestinian human rights groups, our combined resources on paper can't match AIPAC. Thankfully, the truth of our messages and our advocacy concerns have resonance, and they have equal weight in a lot of public discourse. And so we are matching money with facts, and that's what allows groups like us to have sometimes an equal playing field. Now, CARE is most familiar with AIPAC through its history of sponsoring Islamophobic, dishonest, and dangerous political ad campaigns targeting members of Congress, Muslim members of Congress, especially like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, and other elected officials like Cori Bush, who voiced legitimate criticism about Israel's war crimes and human rights violations. Most recently, The Intercept, an online news publication, showed images of Bush being with distorted features, making her forehead look bigger and elongated features. And this was a racist attack that AIPAC had put out on Cori Bush. And it's really similar to a 2001 AIPAC attack, which CARE condemned, which AIPAC paid for, in an advertisement on Facebook targeting Ilhan Omar, where they put a very darkened image of Ilhan Omar with text reading, for Ilhan, there's no difference between America and the Taliban, between Israel and Hamas, between democracies and terrorism. And the accompanying text read, "Stand with America, stand against terrorists." Now, these are the types of smears that are thrown at Muslims who are critical of Israel. I think Ilhan, as CARE and other groups here, have legitimate criticisms, and that doesn't mean we're aligned with terrorism. That means we're trying to correct American foreign policy. For some reason, groups like AIPAC are distorting the images or the color of Black women members of Congress that opposes, and this just keeps happening. So AIPAC defines itself as a lobby for foreign, AIPAC defines itself not as a lobby for a foreign state, but for Americans that support that state, creating a possible loophole for not having to register as a foreign agent. However, it's important to note that AIPAC's founder, Isaiah Kennan, was a registered foreign agent for the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs in their Israel Office of Information, according to the Department of Justice, and that was before he founded AIPAC. To quote a recent progressive Jewish publication, The Forward, from an editorial titled, "It's Time for AIPAC to Register as a Foreign Agent," which was written by M.J. Rosenberg, someone who knew Kennan professionally. After Kennan retired, he found from Kennan that he voiced it was a mistake that he had not registered AIPAC as a foreign agent. Just a little note, Kennan might have been more left-leaning. AIPAC has swung very far right. That was part of the sort of his discontent. But in that Forward article, Rosenberg wrote, quote, toward the end of his life, Kennan was outraged by the AIPAC leadership with its unquestioning support for the occupation of the West Bank and blockade against Gaza and other right-wing Israeli policies. He hated what he saw as AIPAC using its political power to keep the United States government and other influential Americans, and perhaps most importantly, the media, from straying from the Israeli line. Rosenberg concluded, "It's now time to undo Kennan's mistake. It's time to require AIPAC to register as what it is, a foreign agent."
Yay!
From the claps here, I can see that CARE and Code Pink, we both endorse that statement. In a slight turn, in a recent interview, a conservative Kentucky Republican, and no friend of CARE, Representative Thomas Massie told Tucker Carlson that AIPAC has designated representatives assigned to each Republican member of Congress, and I'm sure Democratic members too, to ensure that the lawmakers vote for bills that support Israel. He went on to say in his interview, "Everyone but me has an AIPAC person." Now, I can't confirm the validity of that statement, but AIPAC surely does have enough resources to ensure every member of Congress has an AIPAC person if they wanted to. Simply put, the size, the scope, and the reach of AIPAC present significant challenges in advocating for pro-Palestinian human rights on Capitol Hill. What I can assure you is that CARE, along with many other people here today in groups, are actively fighting against the weaponization of government power to silence criticism of Israeli war crimes, genocide, its human rights record, and the policies of occupation and apartheid. We have seen across the nation the proposal of anti-boycott, divestment, and sanction bills, which chilled the free speech of Americans. This is something that CARE has successfully challenged in other states. They're unconstitutional. We actually just recently saw the introduction of one of these anti-BDS bills in the Senate. So we're going to keep on pushing back against things like this. But I want to be clear that equating political speech with anti-Semitism or anti-Americanism is not only wrong, but it stifles necessary discourse on these issues. We are impacting public discourse despite this uneven playing field. AIPAC cannot forever rely on PR spin when they're faced with videos on social media of Israel occupation forces abusing people, killing people, starving children, incinerating them, or the genocidal statements made by Israeli officials in the Netanyahu cabinet or future cabinets. Americans are just waking up to this reality. So again, this uneven playing field for spending on Capitol Hill cannot defeat the truth of what we are seeing and what we are saying. I'll close by saying our approach to push back on demanding Palestinian human rights must be multifaceted. We need to relentlessly engage in political education campaigns to challenge misconceptions about Islam, about being Muslim in America, about being Arab American, and being Palestinian Americans. And we also need to embolden our allies in Congress to speak out in the face of such unmatched political spending and intimidation. And we have to reassess our relationships with members of Congress that are not actively advocating for Palestinian human rights or upholding civil rights. And we need to encourage stronger backbones against this pressure. In the long term, we also need to work with policymakers to enact legislation that will protect our free speech rights and curtail the previous prohibitions on our free speech, which have just curbed Americans' ability or fear in them to engage in boycotts or criticize Israel openly. We also need to encourage the growth of grassroots stakeholder groups like Code Pink, CARE, and other groups, doubling or tripling our advocacy in grassroots efforts. By positioning ourselves to engage and meet with more congressional offices and staff, we can create a more truthful and less biased playing field. So by working together, by amplifying our voices and holding these institutions of government accountable, we're going to create a more just and inclusive future for all Americans. So I'm just going to end by saying each one of you here today has a role to play, and thank you.
Excellent job. And this was last minute, like yesterday, we talked.
I
So that was great. Also, I want to say that we now have over 700 people watching online. And let's just take a moment to reflect that we are here in the people's house, what is supposed to be the people's house. And unfortunately, it's more like AIPAC's house than the people's house. And I think, Robert, your calls to reclaim it are absolutely essential right now. So we want to make this a little interactive here, and we hope you can stay with us for Q&A. But just a minute, we want to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, which was about Tom Massie. Now, Tom Massie is a Republican. He's one of the very few Republicans that have voted against money to Israel. And it has made him a target of AIPAC. In fact, they put money into a campaign to try to defeat him. But in Kentucky, people tend to love Tom Massie. And so they keep voting him back in again. And it's a good example of somebody who sticks to his literal guns because he's a big gun guy. But he at least has refused to cave into AIPAC. And in fact, he has exposed some very interesting things about AIPAC. So we're going to have two people come up here and read some of the interview between Tucker Carlson and Congressman Tom Massie.
Here, let me give you the floor.
Do you need another copy?
That's right. I don't know how to tie a bow tie.
So is one of you going to be Tucker and the other one is?
Hello, Representative Massie.
If you can speak really loud.
Hello, Representative Massie. Thank you very much for coming on the
So you can get a
program.
little closer.
Thanks very much for coming on my program today.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
You got Republicans.
I have Republicans who come to me on the floor and say, I wish I could vote with you today. Yours is the right vote, but I would just take too much flack back home. And I have Republicans who come to me and say, that's wrong, what AIPAC is doing to you. Let me talk to my AIPAC person. By the way, everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What does that mean exactly, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are, you know, firmly embedded in AIPAC.
And every member has something like this?
I don't know how it works on the Democrat side, but that's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to DC, you have to go to lunch with them. And they've got your cell number and you have conversations with them.
That's absolutely crazy.
I've had 4 members of Congress say, I'll talk to my AIPAC person. That's clearly what we call them, my AIPAC guy. I'll talk to my AIPAC guy and see if I can get them to, you know, dial those ads back.
And why have I never heard of this before?
Well, Tucker, it doesn't benefit anybody to talk about it. Why would they want to tell their constituents that they basically got a buddy system with somebody who's representing a foreign country? It doesn't benefit the congressman for people to know that, so they're not going to tell you that. They also pay for trips for congressmen and their spouses to go to Israel. I'm probably one of a dozen Republicans who hasn't taken that trip, and the other ones just haven't gotten around to it.
Medea noted that Massie has actually banned AIPAC from his office, so that's something.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Can I say quickly, it's worth Googling that interview just to watch that snippet. I mean, it's incredible. I have to hand it to Thomas Massie for having finally sort of opened this can of worms. So it was incredible to watch. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Incredible interview, exposed the whole babysitter phenomena. And it is wonderful that he has banned AIPAC from his office. So just to go back a little on the founding of AIPAC, it was first founded in 1955 as the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs. It took the name AIPAC in 1963, but it really became a powerhouse in the 70s and the 80s. And the kind of things that AIPAC has lobbied for, maybe we could, a show of hands if you know something that AIPAC has been pushing for. Say one thing.
moving the embassy to Jerusalem.
Can you speak loudly?
Moving the embassy to Jerusalem.
Moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Excellent.
Settlements.
Settlements, illegal settlements, as we have just seen from the International Court of Justice.
They lobbied against investigating Shireen Abu Akleh's murder by Israel.
Wow, I didn't even know that. Against investigating the murder of Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Yes. American. More money to Israel for weapons. That is the number one thing they lobby for. And before October 7th, it was the yearly almost $4 billion of our tax money that goes to Israel. Anybody think Israel is a poor country?
No.
Uh-huh.
GDP higher than France this year.
GP higher than France. Anything else about Israel's economy?
Free health care.
Free health care. Do we have that here?
No.
No. Yeah.
I just interject a little bit of a non-sequitur. I come from West Virginia. The life expectancy for males at birth in McDowell County is 63 years.
Wow.
So that's money we're not spending at home that's going to these wars.
Absolutely. And when you think of all these Republicans that say America first, they too, except for Tom Massie and a couple of others, they all are in favor of sending billions of dollars.
Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of Mississippi, doesn't have clean water. So Israel has clean water. Settlers have clean water.
So the issue of money to Israel, of course, became even bigger after October 7th, of sending $17 billion to Israel. And then there is that package of, quote, sales of weapons, $18 billion. That sale is really, we're paying for it ourselves because they take it from the money that we give them. What else does AIPAC push for?
I have a question. So this money, first of all, much of it goes to the military industry, and then it recycles back, because then they put it in the lobbying, and the lobbying put it in the pocket of the senator. So we have a recycling of these billions of dollars. And I wonder how this works with AIPAC too. I mean, part of it goes back to AIPAC.
It's not just AIPAC that will get the money from the donors, but if you're Raytheon, or if you're Lockheed Martin, or if you're one of these weapons suppliers, you're going to also have your advocates on Capitol Hill saying, yeah, $18 more billion in aid to Israel is a good idea. So it can be a force multiplying effect. There is also a number of Christian Zionist organizations, which is, just as expansive and, behind the scenes, if not publicly, pushing for this as well.
And Shlomo is Israeli. We have, can we say, Odelia is Israeli as well. So please add in whenever you feel that you would like to. Yes.
I'm sort of like a numbers person. So you mentioned $18 billion that we sell in weapons, and essentially you're saying that is the amount that we're essentially paying for it, even though Israel is paying for it. How do you map that? Like, how is Israel? What amount are we giving them versus the amount that they're spending on like how does it all end up with them not really paying for it and us actually footing the bill? Is there like some kind of schematic with numbers?
Yeah, if you look at the appropriation bills that are passed, they actually will break them up into multi-million-dollar sections. And so they'll say, well, we're giving a certain amount for Palestinian aid, a small amount to morally couch themselves. And the rest can then be going for direct military aid for Israel. Part of it will be going for what they call defensive weaponry, which is their Iron Dome program.
Which is like 3 point something billion.
Which will be a certain amount. Okay. And then another portion will actually be for offensive weaponry, and that could be in the form of ammunitions and certain types of bombs. Now, that can go directly to Israel, and then they can get permissions to purchase U.S. weapons. And sometimes you'll see that the Biden administration has approved, $5 billion in munition sales to Israel. Well, that isn't us actually giving Israel $5 billion, but that's saying and doing the paperwork saying Israel is authorized, in fact, and sometimes prioritized ahead of other countries to make these weapon purchases. And a lot of the time it's a combination of the aid that will give them for these offensive weapon purchases in addition to their own funds. But a lot of the times they're either subsidizing or outright supplying the money earmarked in these foreign affairs spending bills for Israel. So you just have to kind of look at the bill and the different sections for, what the money is being appropriated for.
Is there this something exists like just to see the money in, like the money we give them as taxpayer, which I understand was that $3 billion plus another supplementary, and then the money that they actually spend to buy, just to kind of see.
I've seen it documented in places, but Medea, on the exact sourcing of the information, I just see it from different nonprofits or sometimes Israeli groups posting.
I would just add that a lot of the weapons transfers to Israel since the beginning of the war have been under a threshold that the administration has to provide public notification of these weapons sales. So it's something I think around under $50 million, which is the highest threshold of any country given weapons by the United States. If it's under $50 million, the administration can send infinite amounts of weapons packages to Israel. And so we actually don't know how much money and how many weapons have been sent to Israel in the last year. They've made very few actual notifications, and some have been within these foreign affairs spending bills.
So let's keep going. What else does AIPAC lobby for, Martha?
If it hasn't already been said, the efforts to stop the BDS movement.
So BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. AIPAC has been very much against that and is involved. I think, we have to put it in the broader context. They write bills, they write resolutions, they write letters that then become ones that are introduced. In fact, they once bragged that they could write a bill on a napkin and get 80 members of Congress to sign on to it. So they are involved in actually writing legislation. Yeah.
They've also been involved in stifling student speech on campuses.
Stifling student speech on campuses. Did you want to add?
I was just
loud, please.
UNRA with the smearing and defunding of UNRA. It's been huge in the past 10 months specifically.
And even before October 7th, AIPAC was against UNRWA, was trying to abolish UNRWA. Anything else?
Just two big ones, the ICJ and the ICC, separate designations, one referring Netanyahu as a war criminal seeking a warrant, the other recognizing that the occupation of Palestinian territory by Israel is illegal. They've actively lobbied members of Congress to harass these international legal panels on.
Excellent. So let's just keep going for a minute. What other things have they lobbied for? No. So
you did.
You did, yes. Expanding the definition of anti-Semitism to include anti-Zionism. And in general, they have been using their funds to basically take AIPAC, Israel talking points. And when we talked about the efforts that have been in the past to make AIPAC register as a foreign agent, they say, well, we don't get money from Israel, but they do get their propaganda, their talking points, definitely directly from Israel. Anybody remember in the days of the after 9/11 what AIPAC was pushing for?
War with Iraq.
War with Iraq, exactly. They were a major promoter of war with Iraq. And in the case of Iran, what? Sanctions. They have been always advocating for crippling sanctions against Iran.
And I believe they lobbied against the nuclear deal.
They were a little ambivalent on the nuclear deal, but they were opposed to it. They just have focused much more on the sanctions issue, saying if you cripple Iran, they won't have the money to support these other groups in the region that are opposed to Israel. So the other thing they have been pushing for when we talk about the region, what have they been advocating for in terms of Israel's relations with other countries in the region? Normalization. Anybody want to explain what normalization means?
Recognizing Israel as a legitimate state, economically and politically, to create trade options and also create to kind of undermine that there's anything illegitimate about the way Israel governs.
And under Trump, these became known as the Abraham Accords, and Israel has been pushing very heavily for that. Let's take a break for a moment now and have somebody come up and explain to us one example of AIPAC taking out a progressive member of Congress. Tina.
So this is regarding Jamal Bowman, who was defeated by Latimer in June. Jamal Bowman was a first-time congressman, a progressive black former high school principal from Westchester County, New York. After Israel's overwhelming response to the October 7th attack, he became an outspoken critic of Israel and a strong proponent of a ceasefire. When Jamal Bowman's district was redrawn to include more of the wealthy neighborhoods, AIPAC realized that Bowman was vulnerable. AIPAC picked white, middle-of-the-road, pro-Israel Westchester County Executive George Latimer to oppose him, and then showered Latimer with cash. The ads AIPAC put out did not talk about Israel, but smeared Bowman's character and criticized him as a hothead who was not a reliable member of the Democratic team. In the words of President of the Arab American Institute, Jim Zogby, the race became the angry, frightening young black man versus the calm, thoughtful, older white guy. By throwing $17 million into the race, pro-Israel groups turned this primary into the most expensive one in U.S. history. When Bowman lost, AIPAC then turned around and declared that the race shows that the pro-Israel position is both good policy and good politics. On the contrary, it showed that pro-Israel groups can buy elections, and it sent a frightening message to all elected officials that if they criticize Israel, even during a genocide, they will pay with their careers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you define the relationship with AIPAC is essentially if the politicians don't do what's beneficial to Israel, AIPAC will then run a smear campaign against them. Like that's sort of how the relationship works, or like how are they able to convert the votes of the people into, them losing?
Yeah. So this is nothing new. It goes back, for example, to the 1980s when AIPAC did not have its own super PAC, but it still had the ability to work with its affiliates to get money to a candidate or get money to a candidate's opponent. And this is something very important to say, that it wasn't until 2021 that AIPAC created its own PAC and created a super PAC, United Democracy Project. But even before that, it had financial clout, and Congress people knew that. So back in the 80s in Illinois, it helped Richard Durbin defeat Representative Paul Finley, who was supportive of talks with PLO leader Yasser Arafat. In 1984, it helped defeat powerful Senator Percy, who, as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, supported a deal to send high-tech planes to Saudi Arabia, something that AIPAC and Israel were opposed to at the time. So it goes way back. Of course, there are more recent examples. We just picked the one of Jamal Bowman. We're going to talk more about Cori Bush. But we know other ones, and I see that we have Julia here. Maybe you could mention some of the other ones that we have focused on as we've been going around in Congress. Yeah, like what happened with Shantel Brown, or why is
Well, I can speak to
Glenn Ivey in office?
Yeah. I think Shantel Brown is a good example.
Speak as loud as you can.
Okay. Shantel Brown is a good example. Motaz has called her the AIPAC princess for this, but Nina Turner was a really progressive candidate in her district. She, much like Cori Bush, was someone who was willing to vote in alignment with her values, and led a lot of legislation that I think most people, when they think about what our democratic values, would normally support. And so AIPAC, in her election in 2020, funneled tons of smear campaigns. That's really like what a lot of the money goes towards, is to delegitimize the candidate. And when Nina Turner lost, that was kind of like a big watershed moment, I think, for a lot of people, of just paying attention even to what AIPAC is and the power that it has. And Shantel Brown has come into office, and she's someone who I think points to how you can be progressive except for Palestine, this kind of statement, because on other issues, she's willing to vote with her Democratic colleagues. She's a woman of color, and that's something else that AIPAC does consistently that we've seen, is they target Black members of Congress to try to kind of, I think, save face, even though this is an incredibly racist organization. And Shantel Brown has come in, and she's gotten a lot of trips to go to Israel as well in the past year. But I think the thing that's noteworthy about her as well is she's now taken a lot of heat for it, and she is less willing to be outspoken about her kind of pro-Israel stance, but she will still vote on all the bills that come up that are kind of in favor of arming Israel to the teeth. She will still vote that way. But this happens, like, it's really much of a pattern. It's not something that we're just seeing for the first time with Cori Bush. But what I think is really significant is the impacts it's going to have on everybody else. It's not just about, this person that we've lost. It's that every Dem who is doing the political calculus of, do I speak out or not, is saying, I don't want to play this game. I do not want them to come after me. I do not want to lose my seat. I would rather be a kind of moderate, centrist Dem who doesn't take on Palestine, which is a human rights issue, an issue of where our money is going. I mean, it's such an intersectional key issue for so many voters, but because it can cost you your political career and thus your ability as well to negotiate in other areas, when you see someone like Cori Bush lose her election, it's a total warning. It becomes a threat to everybody else, and I think that's the greatest cost. And even some other senators I've talked to, senators who are really progressive, and I'm not going to say his name because I don't want AIPAC to see this video and come after him. But he's told me to my face, he's like, I am going to vote because of my conscience, but I will not be outspoken on this because I'm trying to work on issues like climate change. I'm trying to work on tax reform. And this could cost me my seat. It really could. So being someone like Cori Bush who introduces the ceasefire resolution, I think we can presume that that is why she is now no longer a representative for us, which is a huge loss because of the fact that she has lived up to the platform that she ran on.
So, is there anybody here who's in the district of Glen Ivy? You're adjacent to it. Do you want to explain how Donna Edwards, a progressive who was very kind of mild in calling out for Palestinian rights? Don't go away, Julia.
I wasn't prepared to
never go away. But how the same pattern happened there, in which Glen Ivy was showered with money from AIPAC and was able to take that seat. Anything you want to add on the Glen Ivy front?
Well, I think the thing that I'll add on about the election is, because we're seeing this pattern over and over and over again, is that is that AIPAC also then is sending you on trips. I'm not sure. I'm coming in late.
No, we didn't talk about the trips.
Okay, so there's a partner organization, the American Israel Education Foundation, and they pay for lavish vacations to Israel. They're the ones that paid back in August of 2023. They took 20 of our Democratic members to Israel, where of course they do not see any of the realities of life for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. They stay in lavish hotels. They go to the Temple Mount. You know, it's just propaganda. And it's been fascinating talking to Glenn Ivey, who has also gone on AIPAC-sponsored trips to Rwanda multiple times, which one can only kind of start to fill in the gaps about why AIPAC might be funding those trips. But he's given me a lot of this kind of, well, Palestine isn't really a genocide propaganda. Rwanda tends to come up as his, this is a genocide. What's going on in Palestine is not. And I think over these decades where he's gone to Israel, he was just in Israel again, meeting with Netanyahu and Gallant after the war crimes charges were issued. And it has astounded me how this congressman can I believe that he believes that Israel is somehow justified in its actions, and that even if every single thing going wrong in Gaza is to blame on Hamas. Hamas is just the evil entity of the world. And so that is another danger, is I think that in time, maybe we can, none of us really know, none of us are in his mind. We can't say he's just totally bought and paid for. We can't say that he actually 100% believes it. But no doubt, he is using the talking points of the trips that he goes on. And I have meant to, and I think it's important if anybody wants to do some investigative journalism, what are these Rwanda trips? Why is AIPAC sending members of Congress to a country in Africa that had a horrific genocide? And also, I should say, an entirely black group of Congress members are the ones that go to Rwanda. So it is just to me, seems a very perverse propaganda trip to weaponize the atrocities waged against others as a means to justify and undermine the atrocities being waged against Palestinians. I can't say any of this for sure because I don't know the content of that trip, but that's another thing that they've been doing.
And how many trips has former Speaker Steny Hoyer taken to Israel? 21 delegations that he has led to Israel. Remember, Israel is a really tiny country with a very small population. And as Tom Massie said, almost every single member of Congress has been on a paid trip to Israel. And of course, seeing what the Israeli government wants them to see. So
I can talk about one. We've talked about it before, but I also think Shri Tanadar's case is a really important one because Shri, when he was in the Michigan legislature, introduced a bill in which he was trying to defund some of the state money going to Israel. He called Israel an apartheid state. He recognized the occupation. He was actually extremely progressive as a representative on this issue. When he ran to now be a federal legislature, AIPAC spent over $2 million against him. He himself had enough money that he was able to finance his own campaign unilaterally. He barely got elected into office. And that following summer, he went on a trip with the American Israel Education Foundation and then filmed a video in which he talked about the terrorists surrounding Israel, that he had realized the beautiful country that Israel was, that it is not a racist state, and since then has voted to sanction the ICC, since then has been one of the, voted to defund the Gaza Health Ministry. So we're talking about someone here who, at one point in time, was willing to put on the legislative record that he saw the apartheid and occupation, and was wanting to be someone who was going to stand up against it. And AIPAC basically bought him. They scared him. They bought him. He just barely got elected, and since then has flipped, done a total 180, and now become a progressive that actually leans more towards being on the farther into the spectrum, where you're willing to go as far as like sanction the ICC, for instance, to support AIPAC's agenda. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's, don't go far.
I'm not prepared for this.
I think it's also important to recognize that AIPAC also destroyed the career of a Jewish member of Congress. Anybody remember who that is? Andy Levin, from the famous political dynasty. Carl Levin was a senator for a long time. Andy Levin was a president of his synagogue. He was a self-declared Zionist, and he was not sufficiently pro-Israeli government for the AIPAC. And what they did is they put $4 million into his opponent, a more conservative, hawkish Haley Stevens. I know what it was. Levin had introduced a bill that AIPAC was very much opposed to that included opposition to the expansion of settlements and the demolition of Palestinian homes. That's what put him in AIPAC's crosshairs. So we see this as a constant. Yes?
I can briefly describe how I won the nomination with a pro-Palestinian anti-genocide platform in West Virginia.
Who?
I did. I basically flew under the radar.
Won the nomination of the
Southern District of West Virginia.
In the Democratic?
Yeah, Democratic primary. Neither one of us in the Democratic primary were well known. The Democrats in West Virginia have been putting forward weak candidates the last 4 or 5 congressional cycles. Nobody was paying the least bit of attention to the race because the Congressman Carol Miller is a lock. Everybody thinks that, West Virginia is a lock for the Republicans in the congressional race. So absolutely nobody was paying any least bit of attention. So I put my name in nomination. I've never shied away from my pro-Palestinian anti-genocide views. You can look on Facebook and Twitter and follow me back on this. And so I won the nomination. So as you might expect, the West Virginia Democrats aren't real happy with me right now. But I won the nomination fair and square.
Excellent. That's very exciting. So we've mentioned a couple of things in passing. I think we want to hone in on a little more how AIPAC actually operates. Because one thing that Robert made clear is that they have a huge budget. Their budget is about $50 million. That's not counting the money now in their PACs and their super PACs. And they have about 400 employees. They have a big building you might see along H Street. It never seems to have people go inside or outside, but they have a huge number of employees. And they have a lot of wealthy donors. Many of their wealthy donors are Republican. Now, AIPAC for a long time was seen as a place for more liberal Democrats, but over the years, it's become closer and closer to the Republicans. It's moved more and more right, as Israel itself has also been moving more and more to the right. One thing that we as Code Pink used to do on a yearly basis is protest the AIPAC conferences when they would come to town. Anybody remember the big conferences that AIPAC would hold yearly? So some of you do, not all of you. They would be huge, like enormous. At one point, I think it was back in 2016, it was at the convention center. They said they had 20,000 people. 20,000 people. Absolutely enormous. And of those, thousands of them were students paid by AIPAC to come to the conference. Many of them were students of color. Many of them were the valedictorians or the student representatives in their schools, in their high schools. They were being brought to DC as well as in colleges. So they would be huge affairs. And Congress people and members of the administration would fall over themselves trying to get a good slot at the AIPAC conference. And they would have an announcement on the outside who is coming, and it would just be constant, like a ticker kind of thing of all the different members of Congress who were coming. And we used to be out there running like we run now in the halls of Congress after them. You know, we would run after the members of Congress saying, you know, why are you going to AIPAC? Look what they're supporting in Palestine. But they would love to go to AIPAC because, of course, this was seen as a very important thing in their careers, to be seen as pro-Israel and to be able to get those AIPAC funds. Now, something curious has happened to those AIPAC conferences, which is they have gone way, 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 way down in numbers. And there's a couple of explanations for that. One is that there were always big protests. We had very big protests. And we would get inside and we would jump on the tables and we would interrupt Netanyahu when he was speaking, and we would get hauled out, and one person ended up in the hospital once. There would be big fracas outside of AIPAC. In fact, I would always get hit by somebody standing outside protesting, and pushed, shoved, hit, and usually by elderly white gentlemen. And in fact, we had to create a new type of a visual, which is a settlement. And we made them a box so we could put it over our head and protect ourselves. It was a joke that the settlements were protecting us. But they were so vicious. And I remember once getting hit by this elderly gentleman, running after him and calling the police, because there were police outside all the time, saying, arrest that man, he just hit me, arrest him. And they would not arrest him. They would never arrest the people who were hitting us. And finally, we said, why? They said, well, we're actually police that are paid for by AIPAC. They were DC police. They were using DC cars. They had DC uniforms. They said, if you want to get somebody arrested, you have to call 911. So just an example of how they even had our police force under their control. And what has happened over the years is that these conferences, I think partly because of the protests, COVID really did a number on them. And then AIPAC is, let's be honest, AIPAC is getting a bad name, thankfully. And so their most recent conference was hidden away in that harbor, what's it called? The National Harbor. Yeah, which is really hard to get to, no public transportation. They had just a couple of thousand people there, right, Pualihi? You went there to scope it out? It was not huge, right? It was not huge. And the next day when they do their lobbying, we expected the buses to be coming in and thousands of people coming in to lobby as they did in the past. It was not big like it has been. And I think we should take some credit for that, is that AIPAC now wants to do things in hidden locations, not announcing it, and that representatives are not only not falling over themselves, they're shying away from speaking at AIPAC conferences. The first one to say, I'm not speaking at an AIPAC conference, was Bernie Sanders. And he was like, oh my God, Bernie's not speaking. And now most members of Congress, I think, would not feel really comfortable having their name advertised as speaking at an AIPAC conference. Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah.
About 5 years ago, a number of small media investigative teams, including people at the Trace, started investigating the NRA for self-dealing and corruption. And they found a lot of dirt. And it has gone so far that a Manhattan jury in February found CEO Wayne LaPierre liable. And AIPAC has never been investigated. It's the largest American organization to never have any sort of serious media investigation. And there is, in all likelihood, a lot of material there. And there are a lot of independent, but very serious media organizations, places like, The Intercept and many others that have recently kind of flowered. And there's a lot of potential for really showing AIPAC up, and they've been immune for so long much like Israel itself, that when there's a spotlight shown on them, it reveals a lot.
Well, I think that's an excellent example to give. And, you know, NRA has really been destroyed by that investigation. And another thing to say in the comparison to NRA, people used to always say NRA is the largest domestic lobby and AIPAC is the largest foreign lobby, or suppose domestic group that lobbies on foreign issues. AIPAC was known to be Republican, very much pro-Republican. And AIPAC prided itself in being bipartisan. And it would always try to have good relations with an administration, no matter if it was a Democrat or Republican. There were always disagreements in those, sometimes between AIPAC and administration. Ronald Reagan wanted to do that Saudi Arabia arms fighter jets deal that the AIPAC did not want to do. There were big disagreements under Obama. You might have remembered a lot of that revolved around what was considered Obama's signature foreign policy accomplishment, the Iran nuclear deal, that AIPAC was not supportive of. But it did pride itself in being bipartisan. In fact, you know, I talked about the conference it would have. It would have literally hundreds of Congress people there, and they would be Democrats and Republicans. Now, AIPAC is viewed as much more of a Republican organization because it gets so much of its money from Republicans, and also it focuses on taking out Democrats. Now, a lot of times it's not taking out Democrats for a Republican, because oftentimes those districts are Democrat districts, but it's taking out a progressive Democrat for a more conservative Democrat. Puli.
So I wanted to say too, one of the big things about AIPAC is that within the Republican Party, they changed the campaign finance laws so that now you can pour inordinate amounts of money into campaigns, which before you couldn't do that. So Nasser, I met him, he was a candidate out of Michigan, where Rashida Tlaib just won her primary, but they offered him, from his own voice to me, $20 million to run against her. So that's really kind of what we're looking at, right? And even in Jamal Bowman's case, right? So at first it was 17 million, but it ended up being 25 million. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we come up with with Cori Bush. How much did they actually spend? And so we're no longer voting for our candidates because AIPAC is choosing his people.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. And what you didn't say is the most important thing. He refused to take the $20 million. And that means that Rashida Tlaib is, quote, safe in her district, which is really, really important. And let's give a hand of applause for her. It also shows that AIPAC picks and chooses who they're going to go against depending on how vulnerable. And somebody who they decided was not vulnerable is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So she is, quote, safe in her district. They tried to get rid of Summer Lee in Pittsburgh. They tried and they failed to get rid of Summer Lee. So as we are mourning what they did to Jamal Bowman and to Cori Bush, let's remember, they, despite their own propaganda, they are not always successful. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah, Julie.
I just wanted to also add that one of the things that AIPAC has on their website is this space with all of the candidates that are AIPAC sponsored and affiliated. And you have the opportunity as just whoever you are to go in and donate somewhere on a sliding scale between $500 and $2,500 at any time. But AIPAC will also pause your profile if you vote a way they don't like. So like 1 week, let's say I didn't vote to defund the Gaza Health Ministry. Oh, well, now you're told from the page you're on like 1 month detention from getting the funding. You do something you really like, you might get a flood of donations. And so sometimes this is where some of AIPAC's financial influence is not really transparent as well, because we have candidates. One is Marie Perez. I can't say definitively again, I'm not going to make some sort of statement about what is actually true. But following, she's a Democrat, she's from Washington, but she votes so staunchly more than this kind of Republican side of just defending Israel, giving it all of its weapons. And she has multiple times after significant votes. One was in the beginning or in the middle of April after the Israel Security Supplemental, also just in October, like these 1 month periods. She ended up getting hundreds and thousands of dollars in small amounts of money. Like these, not small, $2,500 not small, but relatively if someone's, pouring into the campaign. And so we can think about, okay, if this candidate who has been outspoken about the need to defend Israel around October is getting hundreds and thousands of dollars in small amounts of money, and then again in April after she votes to send Israel more money, again, here comes hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like, that isn't something that all of us can directly track, but one can assume that there might be this kind of reward train through the AIPAC website where candidates do the right thing. All of the small amounts just come pouring in. They add up to substantial amounts of money. And that no doubt has influence on how they vote. And I think by and large as well, the fact that AIPAC is pausing and unpausing profiles based on these specific marker bills might also point to the role that they have in formulating these things, how much they're tracking them, how much, we know that ADL and AIPAC are often the drafters of a lot of these bills that end up not becoming law, fortunately, because the Senate right now is controlled by the Dems, but certainly raced through the House time and time again. So that's just another thing we don't know. We can't really say for sure, but they have this means to give candidates money.
I can bet that every time when Netanyahu gave his speech and the 10 innovation and all of that, every time they did it, they got $1 million in their pocket. But I want to mention that this is a part of a bigger system that is deeply corrupted. So they basically are using the system that shouldn't be that system, right? So that's number one. Number two, the government of Israel is the enemy of Israel. AIPAC is the enemy of Israel because, and AIPAC in a larger sense is the enemy of the Jews. And my first thought came to me that AIPAC will bring the next Holocaust of the Jews eventually, and that's the big picture.
Did you want to say something
for sure? First of all, Shantel, thank you. As an Israeli American, I moved here recently to do this work on the Hill because work towards Israeli government is talking to a wall. I'll say that the AIPAC Kufi connection, the Christian evangelical Zionist lobby group that also is a huge problem in and of itself, they're kind of endorsing or working with an organization that wants to see the end of this space. Their revelations include war and Gog and Magog, complete chaos and destruction. And they work hand in hand with these people, often overlooking that the goal of Kufi is to create chaos and mass death for the Messiah to come. And AIPAC is running its own course. I think that it speaks multitudes that Israel is now the least safe place for Jews in the entire world. And that has to do completely with the trajectory of this Israeli government, a brutal military occupation, and continued funding and support by bodies that do not have human lives. That's not their top interest. And it is completely cynical to suggest that AIPAC has Israeli lives as their top interest as well.
Moreover,
What is their top interest?
Moreover, when destroying, eventually Israel is committing suicide. So they are actually destroying Israel, and by then they also destroy their investments, because I believe there are a lot of investments going on into the West Bank, especially. And I wonder about these relationships too, which I would like to hear more about. But the main thing is that they are destroying them. This is self-destruction and destruction of Israel and destruction of everything else. It's a suicide in a large sense.
Well, let's also. Well, the question was how much does Kufi give to AIPAC, and we don't know that, but we know there's tremendous interlocking. And when we went to the Kufi conference before getting dragged out of it, we saw a lot of people who were obviously Jewish and people who, when I talked to them, they were members of both CUFI and AIPAC. So there is a lot of interaction. Yeah. CUFI, I always called it CUFI, but they call it CUFI, so it's Christians United for Israel. And it is larger than AIPAC. It is bigger. There are way more Christian Zionists than there are even Jewish Zionists. And as we're talking about AIPAC not being good for the Jewish community, let's also recognize there are other organizations that have come forward to speak for Jews who do not feel represented by AIPAC. One of them you might have heard of is J Street. J Street is, anybody want to describe their impressions of J Street?
I can only say that what I know of J Street is that it was founded to be a counterbalance to like an authentic Jewish organization in the United States that would actually contribute money to campaigns, even if occasionally they would take a year off, to counterbalance the sort of very Likud right-wing focus of AIPAC. They wanted to actually, my understanding is they wanted to actually accept a Palestinian state, work toward a Palestinian state. They wanted to sponsor candidates who would really support such issues. But correct me if I'm wrong, Medea, you should know better.
Liz, you want to add to that?
I mean, I think they're totally disingenuous, but they describe themselves as pro-peace and pro-Israel, and that is not possible. So that's who they are.
So I think these two perceptions are indicative of the way people see J Street. Some of them say, thank goodness there is something that is countering AIPAC and raising money for more sort of liberal Democratic candidates. And others say it is Zionist light, and it really does support the state of Israel. And so there's other groups that have come forward. What other groups have you heard of or been part of?
Jewish Voice for Peace.
So Jewish Voice for Peace. Anybody want to say anything about what?
If not now.
So Jewish Voice for Peace. In fact, they have been doing some of the best demonstrations that you might have seen. Their work in New York City has been just spectacular, and they have come en masse here to the Capitol and done some really beautiful civil disobedience actions here. Last night, I participated in a Jewish Voice for Peace walk around D.C. to show the Zionist connections right in our own town. And it was a very eye-opening evening walk and discussion, going to banks. We went to Citibank and they talked about their investments. They went to Chase, they went to Starbucks, other places. They do fantastic work. And then somebody mentioned If Not Now, which is basically a youth group of Jews in the United States that have been very, very outspoken and organizing in the Jewish community. Does anybody want to say anything about If Not Now? So I would just say that they have a campaign called Reject AIPAC that other groups are part of, like Justice Democrats. And they have been doing the bird dogging like we do. For anybody who doesn't know what bird dogging is, it's running after a congressperson and trying to get him to say stupid things, which is not all that hard. And they have been doing it in a different way, which is that they're trying to get members of Congress to pledge not to take AIPAC money. And if you go to the website, you will see the members of Congress. Unfortunately, the numbers are not that high, but they're still working on it, of members of Congress who have rejected AIPAC money. And that's an absolutely critical thing that we have to work towards as we're building a movement where AIPAC does not have that kind of clout that it has today.
There's actually another one which is relatively quiet in the last few years. I haven't heard a lot about it, but it was founded in 1942. It's called the American Council for Judaism, and it's a reform religious Jewish organization that has been very strong for many decades, and they put out an excellent journal detailing pro-Jewish, anti-Zionist positions.
Wonderful. Let's remember there are some good sources of information about what's going on in this country, in Israel, and the region that come from Israel. You want to say some of them?
Of what?
Like 972 sources of information.
Yeah, there's some really good resources that some are joint Palestinian-Israeli resources. So Plus 972 is one that does place a lot of priority on human rights and civil equality. There's Local Call, which has done a lot of investigative journalism. One specific journalist who works there is Yuval Avraham, and he exposed the use of AI in the current genocide in Gaza through Local Call, and he's an incredible journalist and writes there regularly. There are also obviously Israeli and Palestinian human rights orgs operating on the ground with really important reports. B'Tselem recently released a report on torture and mass abuse in these detention centers, where thousands, if not tens of thousands of Palestinians are being killed, basically calling them a network of torture camps currently being run. And I think B'Tselem has been doing really important reporting on this issue today and historically.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's very important. Did you want to?
Well, I mean, I think I would like to ask, in your sort of estimation, what role does Physicians for Human Rights Israel play? Do you feel like they're actually, do you even know, they actually, if you have Twitter, they at least put some things out on Twitter. They're trying
Physicians for
Human Rights?
I'm not totally familiar with the word.
Are you familiar with Combatants for Peace?
Yes.
How can you tell us more about that?
It's an Israeli-Palestinian organization that are doing quite a bit.
Former soldiers, right?
Former soldiers, especially, and also, if not now, also former soldiers who wake up and
breaking sounds.
Are they having an influence in the general population? Or?
Who knows? Yeah, I do receive their emails, and they have some conferences, but I don't know.
So we're going to start winding down. We have 15 minutes left. So if you have questions, suggestions, we will try to get to that. I wanted some volunteers to read some quotes. They're short, so raise your hand if you're willing and you have a loud voice. So if you could come up here, maybe we could take 5 people. Also, we wanted to show here some of the top AIPAC recipients. I think what's interesting here is to see that most of them are Democrats. Remember, it's now coming with a lot of Republican money. Some of them are key members of committees. They like to befriend the Foreign Relations Committees, the Armed Services Committees. Those are very key committees in terms of getting money and weapons to Israel. And of course, the leadership in Congress. So we have the leaders, both Democrat and Republican, in this Congress. Their #1 recipient is AIPAC.
Is this over their career in Congress or just in one cycle?
This is over their career.
Medea?
Yeah.
What about Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Do you have him? How much money he gets, or doesn't he get money?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. And
Or J.D.
so if
Vance.
somebody could look that up while we're here, we can give you the answer. So let's see. I wanted to pay tribute to some of the few Congress people that have stuck their necks out. And we talked about one, Tom Massie, and another one is Mark Pocan from Madison, Wisconsin.
Mark Pocan, a progressive Democrat from Wisconsin, has gotten into a public Twitter confrontation with AIPAC. Back in October 2023, after AIPAC accused him and several of his colleagues of trying to keep Hamas in power, Pocan responded, "We don't support Hamas, we just don't support killing kids, which it seems you do. AIPAC at least pretended to be bipartisan when I first got to Congress. Now they're basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the GOP. It's time to call them out for what they really are. A front group of conservative policy here in the U.S. instead of being afraid of them.
Hey, thank you. Cooley, do you have somebody else who has spoken out about AIPAC?
I do. I have AOC. AOC has said AIPAC endorses scores of January 6th insurrectionists. They are no friend to American democracy. They are one of the more racist and bigoted PACs in Congress, as well, who disproportionately target members of color. They are an extremist organization that destabilizes U.S. democracy. Kentucky Republican Tom Massie, who in a brilliant interview with Tucker Carlson also read.
Thank you. So we also want to go back a little and say, a lot of this is not new. And raise your hand if you've heard of the book by Meir Shanmer and Stephen Walt, The Israel Lobby.
So important.
Yeah, let's say something about the book.
Okay, so just reading on script, this is not somebody in Congress, but about the book. You might have heard of this book, The Israel Lobby, by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. It's dated 2007, so it's been around. They said in their book, the bottom line, and I quote, the bottom line is that AIPAC, a de facto agent for a foreign government, has a stranglehold on Congress. So, but they're much more, it's much more involved. The book is
So next we're going to go back to a former member of Congress, because it's oftentimes the former members of Congress who then feel that they have the, quote, courage to speak out. And in this case, it's Representative Brian Baird, who is from Washington State. And some of you might have heard of him because he was in the district in Olympia, Washington, where the Rachel Corrie was from. Rachel Corrie, the young woman who went to work in the West Bank and in Gaza and was killed by a Caterpillar track bulldozer. And her parents have been involved ever since. And their representative was Brian Baird.
Okay. So Brian Baird says, when key votes are cast, the question on the House floor, troublingly, is often not what is the right thing to do for the United States of America, but is AIPAC going to score this? In terms of talking about the issues, AIPAC staffers would tell us, no, we don't say it that way. We say it this way. There's a whole complex semantic code you learn. After a while, you find yourself saying and repeating it as if it were fact. So I think we've witnessed this all the time with these politicians who I call AIPAC slaves. Oftentimes, they're totally bought when they won't say a thing to us. They ignore us as if we're invisible. Some of them might say a few things, but yeah, it's like, this semantic code that he's referring to. And on another note, I'd like to invite you all. We have weekly pop-up protests in front of AIPAC at 251 H Street Northwest. We're having our next pop-up protest tomorrow morning. It's at 7:30 to 9 a.m. I know it's early, but we catch these people as they're going into their office.
Do they really go in?
You mentioned that there are actually people that go in and out of there, and we shame them. We call them out. Cops get called on us weekly. There's usually no more than 6 of us.
And there are a lot of people driving by.
Yes, it's a major intersection. Yeah, definitely. It's a major intersection there at Mass Ave, in Mount Vernon Square area. It's accessible by Metro. Gallery Place Metro is right there. Join us. It's a good time. We have great banners. You created a great banner. And Trump is she created one that has, and Trump is on that one, right? So
somebody else.
I seem to recall his name is on there. So please, yes, I welcome you all to join us.
Excellent. So tomorrow
morning, 7:30 tonight.
Somebody going in.
Yes.
I think it's a drug laundering building.
Okay. Former Congressman David Price, a Democrat from North Carolina, shortly before his retirement, in October 2021. It wasn't that long ago in the Democratic caucus, including the leadership of the party, when AIPAC said jump, we'd say how high. It was pretty reflexive. I came to be bothered by that, and a lot of members were bothered.
Thank you. So I wanted to bring a quote, and I guess I didn't, from Jimmy Carter, because he was one of the really courageous presidents in this issue when he was in Congress and when he was in the White House and afterwards. And he has said some really strong things about AIPAC and how AIPAC prohibited a real discussion about important issues that they needed to discuss, whether it was in the White House or in Congress. And he called Israel an apartheid state way before other people did.
So this is from Obama, who is one of the biggest war criminals of the decade and has been responsible for sending some of the most money to AIPAC than all of the other most recent presidents. And I think he also spoke about at one point how Palestine, it was always against his gut to not speak out about it because it seemed like such a clear-cut human rights issue, but he didn't because of the power of this lobby. But the quote reads, "Members of both parties worried about crossing AIPAC are worried about crossing AIPAC. Those who criticized Israeli policy too loudly risked being tagged as anti-Israel and possibly anti-Semitic, and confronted with a well-funded opponent in the next election. Clashing with Israel exacted a domestic political cost that simply didn't exist when dealing with any other close U.S. allies."
So if he had any instincts to do anything good, AIPAC helped to pull him in the other direction. And when Tina talked about all the money that he allocated, it was under Obama that there was this 10-year memorandum of understanding to give Israel $30 billion over the course of 10 years, which is now more than that because they're getting about $4 billion a year.
But does anybody know why Obama actually allowed that to happen?
I think what we've talked about for the last hour and a half is about how AIPAC is so ingrained everywhere.
It's just that.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just that. I'm sure there's many other factors as well, but that's a big factor. And that, I think, brings us to the closing of this, which is to say that we're in deep doo-doo. We've talked about AIPAC not having the same kind of galas that it had before. We talk about AIPAC not being able to take out all of the members of Congress that it would like to take out. But let's recognize that AIPAC has inordinate amount of power. And while we might not be able to have the kind of financial resources, we should be able to out-organize them. And that's what we're not doing. We have a lot of little groups. We have groups that fight among each other. We have groups that are divided because they're just a little different in their either the tactics, their strategies, or their policy position. And it favors the status quo. And so we really got to think about how are we going to build and in some ways use a model that AIPAC has been doing, which is not only do they have people in DC who do the lobbying here, but they have caucuses in every single state. And they have district groups, and they have groups that meet on a regular basis with their congressperson. When we talked about the babysitter is a local person. The babysitter is not one of us here in Congress who says, oh, I'm going to pick, Arizona. It's a local person in that local district. And so as we're opposing and trying to change our government's policies, we really have to think about how we're going to organize on a much, much more efficient and much more massive scale. So is there anything else before we're going to close on reading something about Cori Bush and then we're going to go to her office?
I think in my research see where AIPAC made any direct contributions to Donald Trump's presidential campaign this go around, but the Republican Jewish coalition has donated over $2.7 million to this campaign. Now, I don't want to conflate Judaism and Zionism, but that's just what I found.
Excellent. Thank you for looking that up. And let's remember that AIPAC was very happy with most of what Trump did, like moving the embassy, like the massive amounts of money that was sent. And they did criticize Trump around the Charlottesville rally with him saying there were good people on both sides when they were there yelling, "Jews will not replace us." And also they did criticize the January 6th insurrection, but they turned around and then endorsed 109 members of the Republican Party who refused to say that Biden had won the election. We talked about FARA and trying to revive that idea that would force them to register as a foreign agent. Anything else that people would like to suggest?
I was reading a couple of nights ago where there was a discussion about the local movement to get the city council to adopt a ceasefire resolution. And the person that was holding it said that he talked to a council person that revealed that the reason it did not pass is because AIPAC and the Jewish Defense League had told them that if it were to pass, AIPAC and JDL would shut down City Hall. And the way that they would do that would be by incessant phone calls and messages and just incapacitate.
And where was this?
Where was it?
Oh, this is here.
Yeah,
this is here. You know, there's been a big campaign to get DC to pass a ceasefire resolution. And it's been, thank you, Robert. Let's give Robert a hand. And we have just not been able to do it. And there you go. But we will keep pushing, and I think that will be a good example of our people power overcoming them, because I think we'll be able to do it when they're back from the recess. So I'm just gonna read a short thing about Cori Bush. I wrote a longer article about it, which you can find online on the Code Pink website. But just to recognize that Cori Bush was a once unhoused person. She was a single mother. She was a survivor of gun violence, domestic violence, sexual assault. She became a nurse and a pastor, and then an activist after Michael Brown was killed. And she was out on the streets for 400 days as part of the Black Lives Movement. She is the real deal, but one of the very, very few unique voices here in Congress. She has been an advocate for women's reproductive rights. She got onto the floor of the House here and told her story about why she needed to have an abortion. She introduced all kinds of legislation to protect women's reproductive rights. Being unhoused herself, she was also an advocate for homeless people. And I remember joining her on the steps of this Capitol. And I'm getting broken up just thinking about it, because it was right as we were getting over COVID. There had been a moratorium on evictions during COVID, and it was about to be lifted. And she had heard from lots of people that they would be losing their apartments, that they would become homeless. And so she said, I just can't sit by and watch that happen. And she grabbed a sleeping bag and a lawn chair and camped out for 3 days on the Capitol steps. And I was there during that time and just watching her take her activism and bring it right here to Washington, D.C. And it was successful. It embarrassed Biden. And so he extended that moratorium, and many, many people were able to remain in their homes and their apartments thanks to the activism of Cori Bush. After October 7th, she became a major proponent of efforts to create a ceasefire, and in fact, the first and only ceasefire resolution in this House was introduced by Cori Bush. And she got a lot of pushback for it. And because of that, she became a target of AIPAC. And so we just saw in this election people power of people streaming into her district, both local people who love Cori Bush, as well as outsiders, outside groups in the Muslim community, outside groups in the Jewish community, that went in to support her and knocking on thousands of doors, doing many, many, many thousands of phone calls. But they were just not able to overcome the power of the money. And the money was $9 million that was put into attack ads. And these attack ads distorted her record, said that she didn't vote for the infrastructure project, which she didn't vote for as part of the strategy to get more things into the Build Back Better Act. Distorted her, even her face, distorted her photo by elongating her forehead, by darkening her skin. And curiously, did not mention Israel. And yet these attack ads were so many that they changed the way people thought about her, and they were successful in getting her opponent, Wesley Bell, to be able to beat her. And I think it's a real tragedy that money has that power right now. The U.S. puts itself forward in the world as a democratic country. Some of us never thought it was all that democratic, but it's proving to be less and less so. And I think AIPAC has hijacked Cori Bush's campaign, has hijacked our elections, and has hijacked our foreign policy. And so I think we should go to Cori Bush's office, pay our respects to her staff that have been working so hard, leave messages. You know, you can put outside on the door messages, and we have Post-its that we can do. We're saying goodbye to the live stream, and we'll just move on to the action part of this. How many people did we have in the